The bar is a third place. That is, a place away from work and home where people can hang out and socialize with their friends and neighbors. One example is the British pub, which is not just a place to drink, but it's also the social hub for the local community. A place where anyone can hang out, talk to each other, and make new friends. There is, however, one big problem. Drunk driving kills more than 10,000 Americans every year, which is equivalent to one death every 40 minutes. In total, it makes up a third of all traffic fatalities in the US and Canada. Drunk driving is undoubtedly a very, very bad thing, and ideally, people should not be driving to and from the bar. But if that's the case, then why do most bars in America have such big parking lots? Well, the short answer is that many American cities have laws known as parking requirements, which force every building, no matter what purpose it serves, to provide a ton of parking spaces. For example, the city of Long Beach, California requires that every bar must provide 20 parking spaces for every 1,000 square feet of floor area. These mandated parking spaces are completely free, and having this big piece of soulless pavement in front of every store makes your city less walkable. This encourages everyone to drive everywhere, even to places that serve alcohol. Now, parking is not the only problem. North American cities also have strict zoning laws that separate commercial and residential buildings, which leads to a big area with just houses and another separate area for all the businesses. As a result, most bars in suburbia are very difficult, or sometimes impossible, to access without a car. Public transit is either bad or non-existent due to the low densities and large distances. But even if you technically live within walking distance, the roads are dangerous for pedestrians. So we don't want people to drink and drive, but we exclusively build places where driving is the only practical option. Now, what people are expected to do is to call a taxi, and although they have proven to reduce drunk driving, taxis and ride-sharing services aren't really affordable for many young people. Taxis are also still cars, and they have all the other externalities of cars, such as pollution and traffic. When thousands of drunk people leave a concert or sports game at the same time, the only thing that can move them efficiently is public transit. Imagine if all these people had to take Ubers instead of the train. So although taxis and rideshare can help fill in the gaps, they ultimately can't be a replacement for actual public transit. And don't take my word for it. Here's what the CEO of Uber said on Twitter after taking the trains in Japan. There's also the option of choosing a designated driver, which is that one loser in the friend group who's not supposed to drink anything so they can drive the rest home. But first of all, I don't have friends, and according to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, there is no evidence that designated driver programs actually work. Instead, the research shows stronger support for alternative transportation programs, aka giving people other ways of getting around so that they don't have to drive a car. Data from the province of Ontario in Canada showed that rural areas have a much higher impaired driving rate than cities. Ottawa, the capital of Canada, had 19% fewer impaired driving convictions than most of the province. And the rate of impaired driving went up the further away people lived from downtown. The lowest impaired driving rates were found in Toronto, particularly the central areas beside the Yonge subway. This data makes it pretty clear that better transit and walkability has a huge impact on drunk driving. But whether or not people walk or take transit is entirely dependent on the design of your city. For example, bars in most of Europe and Asia typically don't sit behind a big parking lot, and they're usually located within a residential area or a mixed-use building that has shops on the ground floor and housing above it. These cities are also generally more walkable and have much better public transportation. That's why in countries like the UK, drunk driving only makes up 16% of all traffic fatalities, despite having a much bigger pub culture than the US and Canada. Nightlife is just so much better in dense urban cities with good transit, such as downtown Toronto. When I'm at the pub, or the club, or the party in the hot tub, I don't have to worry about how I'm getting home. There's so many good transit options that driving a car is basically not even a consideration. I can go to a bar alone at 2 in the morning and get completely wasted, because I know that afterwards, I'll be going home instead of going to jail. Also, I can go to a bar with all my homies, and we don't need a designated driver. We can all get drunk, then go back to my place, so we can cuddle. Unfortunately, we no longer build places like this in North America. Instead, we choose to build suburbs that are centered around the automobile rather than people. Public transit sucks. The roads lack pedestrian infrastructure, and your destination probably has a shit ton of free parking. For example, here's a bar in Las Vegas called The Bar. A very creative name, guys, good job. It sits right across the road from a hotel in a residential neighborhood. But to get there, you would have to cross 8 lanes of traffic, scurry through the desert sand, and then walk across the big parking lot. There is a bus stop nearby, but the bus only comes every 30 minutes, and there's not even a sidewalk. So it should not be a surprise that many people choose the easiest and most convenient option of driving, especially since alcohol is known to make you overconfident and downplay risk. Once again, we don't want people to drink and drive, but at the same time, we have made it as hard as humanly possible to not drive. This brings us to the problem with our approach to road safety in North America. We overemphasize the importance of personal responsibility while neglecting the external factors that influence our behavior. Everyone knows that it's your responsibility to not drink and drive, but it's also the responsibility of urban planners and city leaders to ensure that people can easily and safely get home without driving. It should be their responsibility to build a high-quality transit system as well as safer streets for walking and cycling. But instead, the North American approach focuses on education campaigns and scare tactics while doing nothing about the car-centric system. For example, some US states display safety messages on highway signs, often with some cheeky pun like, "Drive hammered, get nailed." The goal here is to grab people's attention and hopefully change their behavior. But if you think about it, in order to actually read these messages, drivers have to take their eyes off the road. Bruh. One study actually found that displaying these safety messages increased crashes by up to 4.5%. So it seems like these signs are really just a distraction for drivers rather than a safety measure. Another popular awareness campaign is the Every 15 Minutes program, a simulation held at high schools to show what would happen if a student died from a drunk driver. Basically, a few students are chosen to act out a fake car crash, complete with bloody makeup and emergency responders. One student is chosen to be the victim who gets severely injured and dies from the crash. Their parents are notified about their loss. Another student plays the drunk driver who is arrested by police and taken to jail, where they must call their parents to explain what a naughty child they have been. This student is then prosecuted in a fake court session. This whole ordeal is supposed to be very dramatic and emotional. You can find dozens of examples posted to YouTube, often with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of views. But there is no evidence that these education programs even work that well. A report from the Washington Traffic Safety Commission reviewed several studies on school-based education programs, and they found that although they might result in short-term changes in attitude, there is no long-term impact on people's behavior. Also, I think these programs kind of miss the bigger picture, right? Like, of course, teenagers should not be drinking and driving, But it's kind of crazy how this country is so car-centric that high schoolers have to drive. Like, instead of taking the wheel, these kids should be taking the damn bus. Drunk driving among young people is the main reason why the legal drinking age in America is so high compared to other countries. The National Drinking Age Act of 1984 raised the legal drinking age to 21 across the entire country. And although this made a big impact during the 80s and 90s, traffic fatalities related to alcohol have leveled off since the early 2000s. Also, most countries in Europe have a legal drinking age of only 16 to 18, and yet they have much lower drunk driving fatality rates. That's because our efforts to reduce drunk driving are missing a big component: disincentivizing driving itself. After all, the problem is not that people drink, it's that people are driving after they drink. During the 1950s and 60s, drunk driving fatalities started becoming a nationwide crisis, and this was largely fueled by the growth of car culture and the suburbs. After the Second World War, America built planned suburban developments on the outskirts of cities, and the growing economy allowed Americans to purchase a ton of cars. Between 1950 and 1970, the number of cars on American roads increased by over 90 million. This was supported by the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, which allowed 41,000 miles of highways to get built across the country. These new roads spurred even more car-centric development, such as shopping malls, motels, gas stations, and fast food chains. It also didn't help that before the 80s, drunk driving wasn't really taken seriously. Back then, you could pop open a bottle of whiskey and drive to the shopping mall like it was nobody's business. And even if you got into a crash, the cops would likely be pretty chill about it. The good old days, am I right? But all this resulted in a drunk driving epidemic. In 1968, alcohol caused at least 800,000 crashes and 25,000 deaths, which made up nearly half of all traffic fatalities that year. In response, activist groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or MAD, started gaining popularity. They played a major role in reshaping our cultural norms and passing stricter drunk driving laws. But the problem with MAD is that they don't really challenge the car-centric status quo. They've been pushing for autonomous vehicles and alcohol detectors inside of cars, but there's never been a campaign for better public transit or building safer streets. What's even more ironic is that when President Ronald Reagan passed the Minimum Drinking Age Act in 1984, he specifically told states that they would lose federal highway funding if they did not comply. Yeah, so highway funding was used as a threat to ensure that every state adopted the new drinking age, even though building all these highways is part of why drunk driving is so common in the first place. Ultimately, drunk driving is only one part of a much bigger road safety issue. The US has by far the highest road fatality rate out of any developed nation, and 2/3 of all traffic fatalities are not related to alcohol. That's because things like traffic flow and road capacity are routinely prioritized over safety. We build wide roads that enable high vehicle speeds and make walking or cycling very inconvenient. So even without drunk drivers, our roads are still super dangerous, especially since there are many other things that impair people's driving apart from just alcohol. In 2015, the Mythbusters did an episode where they compared driving while on a cell phone with driving while drunk, and they found that distracted driving can be just as, if not more dangerous than drunk driving. In fact, in some parts of Canada, distracted driving has become deadlier than drunk driving. The province of Ontario had 44 fatalities from distracted driving in 2019, compared to just 34 fatalities from impaired driving. And the problem is not just cell phones. You could also be distracted by a highway sign telling you to not be distracted. Furthermore, driving when you're tired can also be just as dangerous as driving drunk. Studies found that only having 4 to 5 hours of sleep can double your chance of a crash, which is similar to having a blood alcohol concentration of 0.05%. And finally, there are so many people with disabilities or health conditions who should not be driving, but car dependency encourages them to drive anyways. So it seems like the common denominator here is driving. We should be focusing on disincentivizing driving so that people who cannot or should not be driving don't have to drive. It doesn't matter if they're drunk, tired, distracted, or stupid. Having viable alternatives to driving means that they can get around just like anybody else without posing a safety risk to other people. Because here's the thing, even if you personally do everything right, even if you follow all the rules of the road and always drive responsibly, you can still be a victim of a crash. That's the problem with focusing on personal responsibility. Road safety is a systemic problem that affects everyone, even if you personally are a safe road user. A comprehensive approach to reducing drunk driving should include a massive expansion of public transit. But the key here is that transit needs to run late at night. For example, the Toronto subway operates until 2 in the morning, and the streetcars run 24/7. Overnight, the subways are replaced by night buses, which come really frequently. In fact, one of these bus routes is nicknamed the Vomit Comet. Zoning laws and parking requirements should also be reformed so that denser, mixed-use neighborhoods can be legally built. Providing more affordable housing closer to cities means that people don't have to travel as far to reach a concert, sports game, or bar. We also need to build safer streets and better public spaces that encourage people to walk and spend time outside. This is important because when everyone is driving in their car, it feels super creepy and dangerous to be walking alone in the dark. But the presence of other people on a lively street is what makes it feel safe, especially late at night. So if we truly want to reduce drunk driving and traffic fatalities in general, we need to design cities so that people only drive when it's absolutely necessary.